From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and here's what's coming up. K-State's Kraig Roozeboom featured today as he'll take a close look at planting wheat into row crop stubble immediately after fall harvest. Multiple years of K-State research have resulted in several recommendations for establishing that new wheat stand. Kraig will also talk about work that he has done on using a desiccant to terminate a grain sorghum crop for earlier harvest to accommodate that wheat planting afterward, saying that can pay off in improved wheat yields. Also today, this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Ward Upham explains what's behind the sudden loss of Atlas cedar trees and other landscape ornamentals in the past few weeks. All that next for you on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today. Thanks for being along with us once more. We are well into the fall harvest in Kansas, of course, and as you producers wrap up those row crop harvests, there might be in mind the thought of planting winter wheat right after those crops come in, and there are several prospects to that you need to be thinking about, as we'll get into today with our guest. He is a cropping systems agronomist with K-State Research and Extension, Kraig Roozeboom. There's an article on this topic, by the way, in the most recent Agronomy E-Update newsletter out of K-State. And one understands, Kraig, why a producer would be following their row crops with wheat, given the market status at the moment.
Right. In most cases, the more bushels you have to sell of whatever crop in your rotation, the better off you are. And especially with relatively higher prices, it gets easier to put that crop out there. And so adding that crop or cycling back to the next crop more quickly by planting a fall crop immediately after the harvest of your summer crop makes some sense.
Yeah. And we're talking no-till, of course, here.
In a lot of cases, that's where at least I am a big fan of no-till situations, and no-tilling allows you to do that both in terms of saving money on not tilling and saving moisture, potentially. Every time you till, you tend to release moisture, and just maintaining soil structure and all the items that go with that. So, yeah, no-till situations, no-tilling wheat into row crop stubble, well, works fairly well.
This is something that you and colleagues in the Department of Agronomy at K-State have studied in field trials intently from various angles over the years. And there are guidelines, to put it that way, to succeeding with that wheat crop, maximizing yields. We wanted to walk through several of those today, and it starts with variety selection, you say.
Right. Obviously, there are a lot of wheat varieties to choose from. When you're going in after a harvest of a summer crop, that may change the traits you're looking for, the characteristics of the variety that you will plant, as opposed to maybe planting in a situation where you're not following a summer crop. And one of the main drivers of that is when you're planting after harvest of a summer crop, often you're planting later than you typically would have. And early development tends to be slowed because you have that higher residue situation. And so you want varieties that do well in that situation. And one of the main consequences of late planting is you reduce the time for those wheat plants to develop fall tillers. And we really rely in many of our systems, most of our wheat production systems, on fall tillers for a big chunk of that yield. Well, if you don't have time to make those fall tillers, you're going to need more plants out there, and by implication, more seeds. So we generally think about upping our seeding rate with late planting, which tends to be associated again with planting after the harvest of a summer row crop. So you need heads to produce the kernels, and you can get those heads either by more plants or by tillers, and when you're planting late, you need more plants.
But that variety needs to have a certain amount of winter hardiness, right high on that scale, though.
Exactly. That's kind of part and parcel of this thing. You need the fall tillers, and it needs to survive the winter well, and survival in no-till conditions tends to be a little tougher than in tilled conditions. There are a number of reasons for that. Oftentimes that crown gets elevated because as it establishes the crown, it's not only emerging through the soil, it's emerging through that residue layer. And if that residue layer is fairly thick, that crown can get established above the soil surface and maybe make it more exposed to the elements over the winter. So you need a variety that can establish that crown as low as possible and handle those cold conditions. So yeah, winter survival is important, tillering ability, and also its ability to emerge in no-till conditions. A lot of varieties are kind of rated on their ability to handle no-till conditions, and that's often tied up with its ability to set the crown low in high residue situations.
What about, as part of that, Kraig, residue management pre-planting?
Right. One of the things you need to think about is uniformity of residue distribution, and that's more of a harvest management situation. So keeping that header as high as you can so you're not gathering it together, even though you have a chaff spreader or something behind the combine or a chopper or whatever that can distribute it, there's still some non-uniformity to that distribution. That's really part of your harvest process. I am not a big fan of chopping stalks or issues like that because that just makes them loose and they blow around and you end up with, potentially anyway, a non-uniform residue situation. And so planting into standing residue would be my recommendation for these situations.
One thing that you stress in the article here, it makes good sense, is tending to that seeding depth to make sure that the seed gets to moisture, of course.
That's right. So when you're setting the depth on the drill, obviously the depth gauge rolls across the surface of the soil, and in a low residue situation, that depth is theoretically depth into the soil. Well, you add a layer of residue on top of that, and then you have some non-uniformity to that residue. And like as I mentioned, you're planting into standing residue. You may actually be going over stalks sometimes and not others. And so that's a bit of a challenge, just something you need to pay attention to. Are you placing that seed not only below the residue but down into the moisture to some extent? So checking the seed placement in the conditions where you're going to plant. Don't just assume that the settings from that previous field are going to put the seed where you want it in this field. And the amount of residue makes a difference, and the condition of that residue, how much is standing, how has it decomposed. You know, if you're planting after corn, maybe you harvested the corn in early September or mid-September, and it's had a little time to settle down and break up, whereas if you're planting after soybeans, there's not that much residue out there to begin with. Planting after sorghum, there's much more, maybe more green living residue in some situations even.
How that drill is set up, though, will that not make some difference here?
Right. You need to make sure that not only is the depth set where it needs to be, but you need to make sure you're penetrating through the residue. And so, you know, if you've got worn discs or you don't have enough weight on the drill, you may not actually even penetrate that residue the way you'd like or cut it. And even residue conditions, you plant early in the morning, high humidities, that residue is soft, it's not very brittle, you're not cutting through it, you'll get hairpinning, things like that. So paying attention to the moisture conditions of the residue can make a difference as well.
Kraig, in attempting to get this wheat crop off on the right foot, clearly it needs access to what nutrients would be required for a good stand establishment. It depends on what crop you're following as to how far you need to go with that fertilizer, right?
That's right. Even when we're not following a summer crop immediately, wheat benefits from having some in-furrow fertility. Some portion of the nitrogen and phosphorus often is important. In-furrow works very well. Following a summer crop, it becomes even more important because that summer crop has just extracted a lot of the nutrients, and so you need to have, it's even more important to have nutrients in association with that seed or that young seedling as it begins to develop. After soybeans, which is a very common situation, when we think about planting sorghum or corn after soybeans in the following summer, we often give that some kind of a nitrogen credit, some amount, depending on soybean yield and crop rotation. Could be 20 to 40 pounds, whatever. We typically do not give a credit to a previous soybean crop to wheat because it's planted so soon after that soybean crop that nitrogen hasn't had time to cycle back around. And soybeans, honestly, extract a lot of nutrients and nitrogen. It uses up all the available nitrogen to fill that seed late in the growing season. And so the wheat really needs that nitrogen early on in the fall, plus early spring when it's developing the head. And so there's just not enough time for that nitrogen to cycle through. So we typically do not recommend a nitrogen or reducing your nitrogen rate after soybeans if you're planting wheat immediately after soybean harvest.
Does it pay to go the other direction and bump that nitrogen rate up following, say, corn or grain sorghum?
Right. After soybeans, you may not need to, but when you're following corn or grain sorghum, yes, there's a lot of research that would support the benefit of adding another 30, 40 pounds of nitrogen, depending on your yield goals and residual situation. And that largely has to do with the fact that both corn and sorghum residues are very high seed-to-N ratio. In other words, they've got a lot of carbon relative to the amount of nitrogen left in them. And so the nitrogen fertilizer you put on the wheat, some of it gets sucked up by that high carbon residue, trying to break that down. And so less of your fertilizer tends to be available for that developing wheat crop. And so you kind of need to add in some extra to feed the residue breakdown as well as feeding your developing wheat crop. Roughly 30 pounds of nitrogen is kind of the rule of thumb for wheat following corn and sorghum, largely because of the residue quality after those crops compared to soybeans.
All right. Well, we'll take a short break here, and then we'll be back with K-State's Kraig Roozeboom and talk more about successfully no-tilling wheat into row crop stubble following harvest this fall. That and more coming right up on Agriculture Today. We're back on Agriculture Today, as is K-State Cropping Systems agronomist Kraig Roozeboom. And what we're visiting about on this edition is following a row crop directly with a wheat seeding. Kraig would like to center on a specific research-based angle on this, and something that K-State has looked at in-field quite deeply. That is the use of a desiccation product to speed up the timing of a grain sorghum harvest. Glyphosate is often the product of choice in making that happen. That not only can help with the grain sorghum harvest, but it could be of benefit to that following wheat crop drilled right into that sorghum stubble, according to the research.
That's right. You may think about wheat following corn or sorghum could be fairly similar, and we just talked about the similarities in terms of nitrogen management, and that's true. But there are some key differences between corn and sorghum. Typically, corn will be harvested earlier, and by the time you harvest the corn, it's pretty much completely senesced. That plant has essentially died, and you've got dead residue there, and again, maybe a little more time for that to even start to break down a little bit. Sorghum, very different. Those plants, when that grain's mature, you may still have a fair amount of green leaf area out there. And so in some cases, that plant canopy could still be using water from the profile. And you harvest the sorghum crop, you've still got green leaves if you haven't had a frost, say. All of those things work together to make it more challenging for that subsequent wheat crop because that sorghum residue hasn't broken down. It's not starting to cycle its in very much. Sorghum has been documented to have some allelopathic characteristics, some compounds that are released from those residues that may suppress growth of other crops. And so there are a lot of things that make wheat after sorghum a little greater challenge. And so applying glyphosate can do a number of things. May speed harvest a little bit, depending on the timing of your sorghum crop and how it's approaching maturity. One of the key things you need to watch, though, if you want to desiccate, let's just take a step back. You want to desiccate, you want to kill that leaf canopy so that it's not using water, so it maybe starts to break down, and you can facilitate. Maybe it'll dry the sorghum down a little faster and you can get in a little bit sooner, although our data would say you may not gain lots of time that way, but it might help. But the bigger issue is just killing that residue to allow your wheat to have a more favorable situation. So some of our data would indicate we can get a fairly substantial yield bump in that next wheat crop if we're able to kill that sorghum several weeks before a typical frost would hit, say. We've had other situations, though, if the sorghum's maturing relatively late, one of the things we have to watch is making sure that sorghum is fully mature. We want to look for the black layer at the base of the head. And so you're waiting on that before you want to apply the glyphosate, or otherwise you're going to potentially hurt your sorghum yield. And so if you have a late sorghum crop or an early frost, then the benefits of applying that glyphosate tend to disappear. And so we had a research project a few years ago where if we were, 3, 4, I think sometimes we were 5 or 6 weeks ahead of frost, and we reached black layer and we applied glyphosate, we had a very nice yield bump in that wheat that was managed pretty similar, the only difference being we applied glyphosate or we didn't. We upped the seeding rates, we added the extra in, but just by applying the glyphosate well ahead of frost, we got a nice bump in the wheat crop.
As much as 5 to 6 bushels?
Exactly. A 10% or more increase in those kinds of situations. The next year, we thought, we're on to something here. The next year, sorghum was maturing more slowly. We had an earlier frost, and I know in at least one situation, we sprayed glyphosate, and it froze that night. And so the difference between the sprayed and unsprayed disappeared within a few hours of applying that because it killed the vegetation, either by frost or glyphosate. And so if you're approaching frost, the benefit of applying the glyphosate tends to disappear.
Right. It's something to take a hard look at, though, especially if you're following grain sorghum with wheat and getting that timing down, so to speak. It could be through the use of glyphosate to early desiccate that crop and move things along. Kraig, the main message here is that producers need to give due thought to quite a few things if they intend to seed wheat directly into that stubble, whatever crop it might be, post-harvest.
That's right. Don't assume you can manage that wheat crop exactly the same as you would if you were following a wheat crop or some other spring harvested crop. You need to pay attention to the effects of the residue. Think about the effects of water extraction in this dry fall. That could be an issue.
You bet.
Also think about the effect of nutrient management, those kinds of things, and the planting into that fairly fresh residue.
There's a great article that covers all of these aspects and more concerning following row crops post-harvest with the no-till direct-seeded wheat crop into that stubble in the Agronomy E-Update newsletter series dated this past Thursday, September the 30th. You can find that at agronomy.ksu.edu. Kraig, thanks for going over all of that with us right here. Always good to talk.
You're welcome, Eric.
Kraig Roozeboom, Cropping Systems Agronomist at Kansas State University. Well, before the next break, a couple of USDA crop program items of interest for you. Again, this from the acting state executive director of the Farm Service Agency here in Kansas, Chuck Pettijohn. He brings up that you've still ample time to report that fall seeded acreage, whether it be wheat following the row crop harvest or conventional wheat plantings or otherwise. However, he's strongly encouraging you to get that taken care of once your harvest is all tied off. And here, Chuck tells why.
Yeah, absolutely. On that, thinking of our fall seeded crops, we've got a acreage reporting date of December 15th. But what we ask you, don't wait till December 15th. We'd like for as many producers to come in and do that right after you get done with your plantings while it's fresh in your mind. Work with these county offices. With the COVID restrictions, it's kind of hard for us a lot of times to get those real short windows close to those deadlines. And so if we can spread our workload out, it certainly helps us and helps you. Work with your local office. I know a lot of them are sending maps, doing map books, doing different things to make arrangements to get this done with the COVID protocols put in place. so we just ask that producers come in timely and help us out so we don't have such a rush at the last minute, and we don't want producers missing any deadlines.
So again, once the dust has settled on this fall's harvest, please do get in contact with your local FSA personnel and submit those acreage numbers for your fall seeded crops to your local FSA outlet. Likewise, if you've raised and harvested a crop not eligible for the conventional insurance program, there is an opportunity to make a claim on any such crop losses through a special USDA program, as Chuck reminds about here.
Just a quick reminder there, if you've got any qualifying losses or you believe that it's a loss, be certain and to, as soon as it's apparent or within 72 hours of the loss, if you've got a crop that you think that might qualify, certainly notify our office so we don't have to deal with a late filed notice of loss. And just thinking about getting into fall harvest with some of these crops, kind of keeping that out as a reminder.
That from the acting state executive director of the Farm Service Agency here in Kansas, Chuck Pettijohn, who, by the way, is being asked repeatedly, he says, about when the new state executive director will be named.
Yeah, it's like I tell my wife, every day we're getting closer. So the state executive director position is a political appointment that follows whatever party is in an office. That particular state executive director position does come as a presidential appointment. And so they have a search committee that puts together those recommendations, and they have not onboarded any state executive directors yet, but they have told us that they've got a number of them back from the White House now, and so hopefully we should see those appointments, those individuals coming here very soon.
Again, the FSA's Chuck Pettijohn there, and he will be back with us on tomorrow's broadcast to discuss several other things regarding USDA program administration here in Kansas, including some dynamics that are going on regarding local Farm Service Agency offices and their staffs stemming from the pandemic situation, and we'll cover those as well as remind about those 2020 crop program payments and where they are in the pipeline currently. So please be tuned in for all of that here tomorrow. But next on Agriculture Today, our weekly horticulture segment for you in a few moments here on the K-State Radio Network. Rounding out this Agriculture Today, it's our weekly horticulture segment, and aboard once more is horticulturist Ward Upham of K-State Research and Extension to give us the word on what could easily be described as a mysterious decline of landscape cedars here and there in Kansas. In fact, it's more frequent than that, probably, Ward, you say. This is a specific type of cedar that is succumbing to whatever's going on here?
Yeah, primarily it's Atlas cedars, but there's other plants that are affected as well. And so we saw, like in July and August, where some of these Atlas cedars completely collapsed, or they had the top die out or the bottom die out. Anyway, there was damage to a lot of these plants, and people are really wondering what's going on. And they'll say they die overnight. Now, they don't, but it's quick. And so that's what people are really concerned about.
You say there is a plausible explanation for this. Go through that, if you would.
There is. Most people think if you're seeing damage like that, it must have been something that happened in the last month or maybe 2 months. Actually, it was last fall. Last fall, we had temperatures drop very, very quickly. For example, in the Wichita area, we had a daytime high of 87 October 22nd and a low of 24 on October 26th. And the problem with that is that those trees hadn't hardened off. 24 degrees isn't going to hurt anything in December once those trees have hardened off. But those trees that hadn't hardened off, it caused some damage. In order to understand exactly what happened, you have to understand how trees work. Mm-hmm. They are what are called vascular plants. In other words, they have pipes that carry stuff. They have what's called the xylem that carries water and nutrients from the roots to the upper part of the plant, and they have phloem that carries the food that's made in the leaves down to the roots. Now, the functional part of xylem is actually dead material. It is tubes that carry the water and nutrients up. There is living xylem, but it's not very efficient in carrying water and nutrients. The phloem, however, that carries the food made in the leaves down is living. When you had that sharp drop in temperature, what happened is that phloem was damaged or killed. And because of that, the roots were not able to get the energy they needed from the leaves.
They couldn't recharge, in effect.
They couldn't. Now, roots have stored energy reserves. They have to in order to survive the winter when there's no leaves on there. But there's a limit to how much energy can be stored. And when they ran out of energy, you had the root hairs die, you had the roots die, and then the top part of the plant followed very quickly. And so, again, this is a quick process. Once they run out of energy, it doesn't take long for at least a portion of that plant to die. And so it's something that happened way last fall, but you didn't see the effect of it until this summer.
If these cedar trees have gone down this path, are they recoverable at all, or is that all she wrote?
If they completely collapsed where, there's no green left, they're done. Now, the way you check that is just to bend some twigs. If they're brittle, if they snap, that part of the tree's dead. If they're still limber, give it some time and see if they stay limber or if they're going to go ahead and become brittle. If a portion of that tree is affected, then you have a decision to make. Imagine if you removed all the dead, whether it's going to be worth keeping. If it isn't, you might as well take it down. If it is worth keeping, then what you want to do is try to avoid any further stress. And what that means is just keep it watered as needed. Especially make sure it goes into the winter with moist soil. Not waterlogged. You don't want to overdo it. You want that soil moist, but not soggy.
Fertilization, is that of value here at all?
Yeah, you can do that. And I don't think you may see much of a response to that, but it's not going to hurt anything. So if you want to fertilize, go ahead and fertilize. And just use a fertilizer that's high in nitrogen. Use it at the rate suggested on the bag, and you'll be fine.
Well, it's an interesting product of what was an extreme turnaround in temperatures last fall. Once again, a 60-degree drop over the course of 24 hours in several locations around Kansas. And this has led to the decline of Atlas cedars in particular in home landscapes. We appreciate the word, Ward. Thank you.
You bet.
Ward Upham with us on this week's horticulture segment. He is a K-State Research and Extension horticulturist. Thanks for joining us. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.